It's 1969. A courier sprints through Honolulu International Airport, a briefcase gripped tight in one hand. He isn't smuggling anything illegal, not exactly. He's smuggling time. Inside the briefcase, the bill of lading for a cargo ship that hasn't even docked yet. In an hour, that ship pulls into port, carrying tons of freight bound for Hawaii. Without this single stack of paperwork, the whole vessel sits idle at the dock, sometimes for days. Every day of delay costs the shipping line thousands of dollars in dock fees and idle wages. Customs won't clear the cargo until it clears the documents first. Shipping companies call this the cost of doing business. Nobody in the shipping industry had bothered to look for a way around it. 3 young men in San Francisco call it an opportunity. Their idea is almost absurdly simple. Fly the paperwork ahead of the ship, land it in Honolulu before the vessel even leaves port, and clear customs before the cargo arrives. It is a bet that a single briefcase can outrun an entire cargo ship. If it works, they save shipping companies weeks of dock fees for the price of one plane ticket. If it doesn't, it's smuggling charges in a foreign customs jurisdiction. It sounds like a courier service. It is actually a loophole nobody had thought to exploit. And within 15 years, it will become one of the largest logistics companies on Earth. Their names were Adrian Dalsey, Larry Hillblom, and Robert Lynn, DHL. Dalsey was 31, a freight forwarder who understood shipping paperwork better than almost anyone in San Francisco. Hillblom was 24, a law student at Berkeley, sharp and restless, already looking for an angle. Lynn was 29, with a business background and the nerve to bet on an untested idea. They met through the shipping business, not through friendship. The friendship came later, built entirely on shared risk. None of the 3 had ever run so much as a small business before, let alone one that broke new ground in international law. In 1969, they pooled together a few $100s, barely enough to cover a single plane ticket. Their entire business plan fit on an index card. Fly to Honolulu ahead of a ship's cargo, carrying nothing but the paperwork that ship needed to clear customs. Hillblom made the first flight himself, briefcase in hand, betting his law school future on a single courier run. If customs accepted the documents early, the ship would be unloading within hours of arrival instead of sitting for days. It worked. Word of a service like this, in an industry that ran on delay, spread inside weeks. A one-time favor for a single shipping line became a standing request from a dozen more. Here's what made the idea work. Regulators write rules for things that already exist. Nobody had written a rule for something that didn't. In the late 1960s, international shipping law had no real category for what Dalsey, Hillblom, and Lynn were doing. Freight forwarders moved cargo. The postal service moved letters. Nobody had a license, or even a legal definition, for flying a single envelope of documents around the world faster than the freight it belonged to. That gap was the entire business. Airlines didn't compete for it because it wasn't freight. Postal services didn't compete for it because it wasn't mail in their monopolies' technical sense. Every country's customs code assumed paperwork traveled with the ship it described, not ahead of it. Customs agencies had never been asked to process paperwork that arrived before its cargo. That single assumption, buried in decades-old shipping law, was the entire opening they needed. The 3 founders weren't disrupting an existing industry. There wasn't one yet. It took a law student to spot a hole a shipping company would never have thought to look for. So they built the plane's schedule themselves, memorized customs offices port by port, and kept flying the documents personally because no company would carry them and no law said they couldn't. There was no salary in the beginning. There was no office furniture worth mentioning, no secretary, no accountant, just 3 men, a phone, and a growing stack of flight tickets. Dalsey, Hillblom, and Lynn split whatever the shipping lines paid them and put almost all of it back into more flights. They slept in airports. They carried cash instead of company credit, because no bank would extend credit to 3 men whose business had no name in any regulatory code. Word spread faster than they expected. Shipping lines in Los Angeles wanted the same service, then Seattle, then routes across the Pacific to Manila, to Hong Kong to Tokyo. Each new city was a fresh gamble, with money they hadn't finished earning back from the last one. Each new city meant a new customs office to learn, a new set of local officials to convince that this was legitimate, and a new flight to personally fly if nobody else could. Failure in any single city could have ended the whole business overnight. By 1971, the 3 of them had turned a one-city favor into a business spanning half the Pacific Rim. And every single expansion meant walking into a country's customs agency and explaining a business model that, legally speaking, did not exist yet. Here's the part most people don't know. In nearly every country, the founders flew into. What they were doing was against the law. This wasn't a technicality they could argue around in court. It was a felony charge waiting to be filed. Postal services around the world held government-protected monopolies on carrying documents across borders. Some countries had jail sentences on the books specifically for unlicensed international couriers. A private courier moving paperwork for a fee wasn't a gray area, it was a direct violation, and in some countries, a criminal one. Customs officials in some ports threatened to seize the documents outright. In others, local postal unions filed complaints demanding couriers be arrested on arrival. Hillblom was once held for questioning in a Pacific port after officials decided his briefcase looked less like paperwork and more like contraband. The three of them kept a mental list of which ports were safe and which weren't, updated after every close call. The company had no legal department. It had no diplomatic cover. It had three men who kept flying anyway, because if they stopped, the whole business collapsed overnight. Every flight was a bet that local authorities would rather look the other way than fight a battle over an envelope. So they got creative. In some countries, they partnered with a local businessman who held the actual operating license, letting DHL run the flights under someone else's legal cover. Sometimes that local partner was a friend of a friend. Sometimes it was a stranger they met a week before the first flight. In others, they simply moved fast enough that by the time a postal authority filed a formal complaint, the company had already proven useful to enough powerful shipping clients that nobody wanted to shut it down. Speed itself became a legal strategy. Regulators can't ban a business model they haven't finished defining yet. They lobbied quietly. They hired local counsel country by country. And they kept expanding anyway, into Singapore, into Australia, into the Middle East, faster than most governments could draft a rule against them. Every new market meant repeating the entire gamble from scratch, with none of the safety net a larger company would have had. By the mid-1970s, DHL was operating in dozens of countries, most of them without anything resembling a clear legal framework for what the company actually did. The strategy wasn't to win every legal fight. It was to become so useful, so fast, that fighting them became more trouble than it was worth. As the company grew, the three founders grew apart. Dalsey and Lynn stayed close to the business's American roots. Hillblom did something stranger. He moved to Saipan, a small island in the northern Mariana Islands, thousands of miles from DHL's American offices. Saipan was a U.S. Commonwealth with its own tax code, close enough to American law to feel safe, far enough from anyone watching closely. Officially, it was about taxes. Saipan's status let him shelter a growing personal fortune. Unofficially, people close to the company noticed something else. Hillblom rarely wore shoes to meetings. He lived modestly for a man worth hundreds of millions, in a house without air conditioning. Employees joked that he ran a global courier empire the way other men ran a beach bar. He answered business calls from a hammock as easily as from a boardroom. He spent increasing amounts of time in the Philippines and Vietnam, far from any DHL office. He still ran major decisions from a distance, flying his own small plane between islands for meetings. To the business world, he was the eccentric genius behind a logistics empire. It made him easy to underestimate, and that suited him fine. Almost nobody yet knew what he was actually building on the side. By the early 1980s, the Loophole three broke college friends had found in Honolulu had become the largest international air courier network on Earth. DHL operated in over 100 countries, more than the United Nations had member states. Employees now numbered in the thousands, spread across 5 continents, most of them hired locally in the very countries DHL had once had to sneak into. Its planes crossed borders that competing services couldn't legally enter. FedEx dominated inside the United States. UPS was still years from thinking globally. DHL owned international. A single envelope could leave Tokyo and clear customs in Frankfurt before most rival couriers had even scheduled the flight. The company that had no legal department in 1969 now negotiated directly with finance ministries. What started with $300 in one plane ticket had become a business worth hundreds of millions of dollars a year, run by a college dropout, a freight forwarder, and a law student who never finished his degree. It had gone, in 13 years, from a felony risk to a fixture of global trade. That kind of reversal almost never happens this fast. Nobody in 1969 would have believed it. By 1982, nobody could deny it. Here's what almost nobody knew at the time. In the Philippines, in Vietnam, and across several other Pacific nations, Hillblom had fathered children with women decades younger than himself. Some of the mothers were teenagers when their relationships with Hillblom began, a detail that would come to define how history remembers him. He never publicly acknowledged any of them. He paid some of the mothers quietly, kept them at a distance from his American and Saipan business circles, and never wrote a single one into his will. He kept meticulous business records, and almost none of a personal life he clearly knew was indefensible. Employees who traveled with him noticed the pattern but rarely spoke of it. Business partners who visited Saipan described a man who seemed to be living two entirely separate lives: the driven billionaire courier magnate by day, and, by his own private arrangement, someone accountable to almost no one. He moved through the region with the same confidence he'd once used to talk his way past customs officials. He kept flying his own plane between islands, between meetings, between the two versions of his life that were never supposed to intersect. Money bought silence for a while. It couldn't buy it forever. Nobody imagined how violently the two lives would eventually collide. May 21, 1995. Larry Hillblom takes off from Saipan in his own seaplane, just as he had hundreds of times before. The weather that day was unremarkable, so was the flight plan. He never lands. Search crews comb the surrounding waters for days, covering hundreds of square miles of open Pacific water. They find wreckage. They never recover his body. For 26 years, he had trusted his own hands at the controls more than anyone else's. It was in its way the one flight he never filed a document for. He is 52 years old, worth an estimated $600 million, and he dies without a wife, without acknowledged children, and, astonishingly for a man who built an empire on paperwork, without a will that names a single heir. For a company built on moving documents faster than anyone else on Earth, its own founder had left behind none of the paperwork that mattered most. In the end, the ocean kept what the paperwork never could, and within weeks, the quiet arrangements he thought he'd buried in 3 different countries were about to surface all at once. Within months, lawyers representing women in the Philippines, Vietnam, and Palau filed claims on behalf of children they said were Hillblom's. Some of the claimants were still children themselves when the case began. Some of the women had never met each other. Their stories converged anyway: the same private arrangements, the same pattern of quiet payments, the same man who never once acknowledged a child in writing. His estate's own trustees fought the claims hard, arguing there was no legal proof any of these children were his. The trustees who fought were protecting hundreds of millions of dollars meant for the Hillblom Foundation, not personal loyalty to Hillblom's memory. So the courts turned to something Hillblom himself could no longer control: his DNA. Investigators exhumed genetic material from his mother's grave in California to compare against the children's samples. Reporters who had never heard of DHL before 1995 suddenly couldn't stop writing about it. It became one of the largest paternity investigations in American legal history, spanning 3 countries and consuming years of litigation. The story that emerged in open court was messier and more human than anything in a corporate biography. And it forced open every secret Hillblom had spent 20 years keeping separate from the company that made his fortune possible. The DNA tests confirmed it. Several of the children were, genetically, Hillblom's. The settlement took years to finalize and cost the estate additional tens of millions of dollars in legal fees alone. The estate ultimately settled for hundreds of millions of dollars, split among the acknowledged children and their mothers across 3 countries. For the children involved, the money came with a recognition that had never come from Hillblom himself. It remains one of the largest paternity settlements ever recorded. What was left of the fortune, once the settlements were paid, went into the Larry L. Hillblom Foundation, a philanthropic fund that today finances medical research, much of it focused on diabetes and aging. The foundation now ranks among the largest private funders of diabetes research in the world. It funds laboratories on 3 continents, none of which exist because of any decision Hillblom made while he was alive. A man who spent 2 decades hiding his children from public record ended up funding one of the more significant private medical research foundations in the Pacific. An outcome nobody, least of all Hillblom, could have designed on purpose. Through all of it, the company kept running. The lawsuits over Hillblom's estate never touched the company's daily operations. Planes kept flying, while the courts argued. Dalsey and Lynn had already sold most of their stakes years earlier, cashing out while the business was still privately held. Hillblom's estate, now tied up in the paternity settlements, gradually sold off its remaining ownership too. In 1998, the German postal service, Deutsche Post, began buying a controlling stake, eventually acquiring the company outright by 2002. Deutsche Post wasn't just buying a logistics network, it was buying the very loophole DHL had built its business on, now fully legal and fully global. By 2002, DHL wasn't a courier company anymore, It was a subsidiary inside one of Europe's largest postal and logistics conglomerates. The three men who once slept in airports to save the company money never saw a cent of what it was ultimately sold for. The three names that had once belonged to three broke friends flying documents across the Pacific became, permanently, the four letters on the side of every yellow and red plane and delivery van in over 200 countries. None of the three original founders were still involved by the time that happened. Today, the company those three men started with a few $100s delivers more than 1.5 billion packages a year, employs over 600,000 people, and operates in nearly every country on Earth. A scale the founders themselves could never have imagined from a cramped office in San Francisco. Its yellow and red livery is now one of the most recognized logos on the planet, seen on more runways than almost any airline. It is part of Deutsche Post DHL Group, one of the largest logistics companies in the world, worth tens of billions of dollars. Nobody boarding a flight today thinks twice about a DHL plane on the tarmac. It has become part of the background of modern trade. The loophole that once required a man to physically run through an airport now runs through fiber optic custom systems processing millions of shipments an hour. Every single day, its planes still do, at industrial scale, exactly what Larry Hillblom did personally with one briefcase in 1969: move paperwork fast enough to beat the goods it belongs to. That's the strange arc of a good loophole. Eventually, it stops looking like one at all. The method never really changed, only the size of it did. Three men built one of the largest logistics companies on Earth by finding a gap nobody else had noticed, and by refusing to stop flying the documents themselves until the gap closed behind them for good. One of them also spent 2 decades building a second hidden life that only came apart after his death. A fortune divided not by the company he built, but by the family he never acknowledged while he was alive. The company survived every one of its founders' personal failures, which is either a tribute to what they built or proof that institutions eventually outgrow the people who start them. Somewhere in the Pacific, a foundation now funds diabetes research using money that once belonged to children Hillblom spent a lifetime pretending didn't exist. Built from nothing usually means a gap in the market. For DHL, it also meant a gap in the law and a gap in one man's own story that took a plane crash to finally close. That's rarely how these stories are told. Usually the founder gets the ending. Here, the company did. If you want to know how more impossible things got built, subscribe.